Welcome to our online symposium, The Now of the Rose. I am Nina Rowe, a professor of art history at Fordham University, and this event is a collaboration between the Center for Medieval Studies at Fordham and the Gallery Les Enluminures. The president and founder of Les Enluminures, Sandra Hyndman, has had the idea for this symposium with the goal of considering the today and tomorrow of scholarship on the manuscript tradition of the Roman de la Rose. Why the manuscript tradition of this text, you may ask? Well, because the Roman de la Rose is a work that many students are used to encountering in tidy little, paperback editions like this one. But of course, our speakers and really all scholars of medieval studies are well aware that every manuscript witness of this text tells its own story, has its own characteristics, because it was packaged to meet the needs of specific audiences. The poem was composed at two moments, toward the beginning and then toward the end of the 13th century, and manuscripts of it were created in France and elsewhere over the generations up into the 16th century. And of course, as was the case with all medieval texts, recensions of the Roman de la Rose varied from one manuscript witness to another. So this versified romp in Old French can stretch to some 22,000 lines in some codices and can appear in truncated versions in other manuscripts, with wording and other formulas, of course, varying from book to book. As the rose was recast, it was copied onto parchment and paper leaves of assorted sizes, enhanced with illuminations crafted in a range of styles and of varying refinement. So there are material and artistic idiosyncrasies to each of the roughly 325 surviving manuscripts of the Rose. It used to be that only scholars who could travel to the libraries owning Rose manuscripts could get a sense of the scope of the genre and the diversity within it. But over the past 20 years, digital technology has granted unprecedented access to the rich variety of Rose manuscripts to anyone with a device and an internet connection. And in this moment, when pandemic conditions still make gathering together tricky, we thought it would be enlightening and fun to take advantage of everyone's newfound comfort with communicating in the Zoomosphere to bring together a cluster of experts on the Roman de la Rose, to have a high-level, sustained investigation of where we're at with Rose scholarship in the digital age. It has been a delight to collaborate with Sandra Hyndman on today's event, and so I thank her and her team at Les Enluminures. I also thank Christina Bruno, the Associate Director of the Fordham Center for Medieval Studies, for handling the administrative and tech side of our gathering. Thanks also to Medieval Studies graduate student Elina Kilcoyne for the gorgeous flyer advertising the event, and to Nicholas Paul, the director of the Center for Medieval Studies, for his eager and enthusiastic support of our online symposium. I am lucky to work with such energetic and generous colleagues. And now I want to say a word about the structure of our proceedings. This colloquy is set up as 4 30-minute conversations. In each of these conversations, 2 speakers will each give short, that is 7-minute presentations, and then engage in a dialogue. So don't worry, there also will be time to take questions from the audience. We're going to disable the chat feature until and then there will be moments when we have the Q&A set up where we'll open things up for broad discussion and you can type your questions in and the moderator will read them. So what are these conversations, you ask? Well, first we've got a conversation on foundations and new avenues with Stephen Nichols and Sandra Hyndman. Then we've got the digital Rose, a conversation between Christine McWebb and Melanie Garcia Sympson. Then we'll open things up for questions for those 4 speakers with my Fordham colleague, Brian Riley, as the moderator. Then it'll be time for our next conversation, the art of the rose, where the speakers will be Elina Gertsman and Jonathan Morton. And then the fourth conversation will be lost and found roses. And this one features Sandra Hyndman again, this time in an exchange with Meradith McMunn. Then at the end, I'll moderate questions posed to those final four speakers. Our program will run until 2:30 Eastern time today, and we are recording the event. We've got an exciting lineup, and I'm eager to get going. So now I'm going to pass the screen over to Brian Riley, Associate Professor of French at Fordham, who will do introductions for the first half of our symposium. Take it away, Brian.
All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce our first conversation, which is titled Foundations and New Avenues, which will be between Stephen Nichols and Sandra Hyndman. Stephen Nichols is the James M. Beall Emeritus Professor of French and Humanities and Research Professor at Johns Hopkins University. With colleagues at JHU's Eisenhower Library, he founded and co-directs the Digital Library of Medieval Manuscripts. Sandra Hyndman is president and founder of the gallery Les Enluminures, founded 30 years ago, and now with branches in Chicago, New York, and Paris. Sandra is also Professor Emerita of Art History at Northwestern University, and previously taught at the Johns Hopkins University. She is author, editor, or co-author of more than a dozen books on medieval manuscript illumination, early printing, and medieval and Renaissance rings. So now I'll turn things over to them both, with Stephen Nichols getting us started.
Thank you, Brian. Let me just get my, oh, here we go. Share, sorry. Okay. The Now of the Rose begins with this image. It shows the insight that liberated the poem from the idea that words alone, in a modern edition, can truly portray a medieval work. It shows the centripetal rose of the critical edition, a coherent work mined from supposedly unreliable manuscripts. Surrounding the edition, we see examples of a centrifugal rose, a work that seeks not coherence, but the clashing of contraries delivered in hundreds of unique manuscripts. This image contrasts the black and white pages of print with colorful folios where scribe and artist recorded their vision of the rose from the late 12th to the early 16th century. And finally, this image shows the digital turn that at last allows us to see the rose as our medieval forebears intended, as a multi-voiced polyphonic work of art. The Now of the Rose means learning to read its pages or folios as multimedia performances. Think of a manuscript folio not as inert, but as flesh, parchment, acting as a dynamic space for recording voices and visions. Imagine the collaboration between scribe and artist, the scribe copying, editing, or changing the words of a long dead poet, the artist inventing the image of that poet while transposing his words into paintings that inject new perspectives into the poetry. The Now of the Rose demands that we abandon the modern concept of unique authorship in favor of a collaborative model of creation. The Rose is a good example because it's the work of two poets, Guillaume de Loris, around 1235, and Jean de Meaux, around 1280. It used creative appropriation from the beginning. Jean readily acknowledges Guillaume's role as originator of the poem, but has Amour, the god of love, proclaim him love's true advocate. Jean claims his place as the Rose's master poet by giving the work a much broader focus than Guillaume's. His blatant appropriation influenced the way artists portrayed him and Guillaume, as the next slides reveal. But first, we need to bear in mind that poet portraits are always ambiguous, representing both the original poet and the scribe who gives voice to the work. As noted above, Rhode's manuscripts depict its two poets very differently. This is not only because Jean arrogates poetic authority to himself, it's also that from the beginning, Guillaume figures in his narrative in two ways. First, as a 20-year-old lover, protagonist of the allegorical dream that frames the poem. And that's exactly how artists portray him. For example, here on the opening page, we call these incipits of BNF manuscript 25526 on the left, which shows the young Guillaume entering his allegorical dream narrative in 4 panels. The image shows Guillaume as lover, but at the cost of representing him as poet. In fact, there is no image of Guillaume as mature poet. That privilege is reserved for Jean de Meun, whose portrait often appears as in the Valencia rose on the right, at the point where Jean later tells us that Guillaume's poem breaks off and his begins. Jean's image does more than mark this rupture, however. By his position on folio 31 of a total of 150 folios, it offers ocular testimony to the commanding presence and monumental nature of his 18,000-line poem. The Now of the Rose recognizes the asynchronous nature of textual transmission, meaning simply that while the date of creation, the 1280s in the case of Jean de Meun, remains fixed, the poem was transmitted via unique versions for more than 2 centuries. The scribes and artists responsible for each iteration lived in times and cultural spaces different from those of Guillaume de Loris and Jean de Meun. Since language, customs, dress, and social perceptions continually evolve, scribes and artists responsible for manuscripts naturally reflected such changes in their work. Their patrons expected as much. For them, the rose was a contemporary work, not an historical artifact. As a result, dynamic variation characterizes rose manuscripts, making each unique. Dynamic variation also makes it possible to track aesthetic, artistic, scribal, and to some extent, linguistic modes over time. But even though each manuscript is unique, they all convey a recognizable version of the rose, thanks to the creative tension between dynamic variation and what I call mutable stability among components of the manuscript matrix. We see this tension at work in slide 6, where color, paint, design, layout, and style mark the most salient variables between these two codices. Although both originated in Paris, circa 1325 and 1350 to 60 respectively, Morgan 132 on the left exhibits stylistic traits characteristic of the first half of the century, and meanwhile on the right, the colors and execution of the miniature, escutcheon, decorated initials, and decorative foliage of University of Chicago 1380 on the right attest to Paris's rise to preeminence in manuscript illumination by 1375. If eye and taste favor aesthetic variation, equally salient elements attest to the kinship of the two incipits. For example, the introductory miniature, the figure lying asleep with a flowering rose bush next to the bed, the decorated initial M at the beginning of the first text column, the decorated Q a few lines below, and of course the words of the preface to the poem. Even though each element presents differently, they are what the Middle Ages recognized as the same. This phenomenon of sameness with difference or mutable stability assured a continuity of rose texts for more than 2 centuries of transmission by unique manuscripts. Slide 6 Finally, the Now of the Rose allows us to integrate pedagogy directly into our digital library of medieval manuscripts at Johns Hopkins. In a teaching case, study section, each of these short demonstrations introduces students to different aspects of the rose as a digital artifact. We welcome contributions to this section from teachers and graduate students who wish to share their own teaching experiences. So these are but a few of the lessons the Now of the Rose has taught us since 1991, when in the new philology issue of Speculum, I proposed that we study the Homo de la Rose as an open, generative work across the expansive landscape of its authentically medieval versions. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Oops. Hello?
Yes, you're all set.
Yes.
Yes. First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here today. Let me thank everyone. And I'm here with former colleagues like Steve and former students like Nina, and a very illustrious cast of speakers, as well as our quite large Zoom audience. So thank you, everyone. In 2015, Jonathan Morton, who I'm pleased to say has joined us today, wrote a cogent analysis of the reception of the Roman de la Rose in scholarship of the previous century. He noted that 300 books appeared in 25 years, 1965 to 1900, and 400 in the next 15 years, from 1990 to 2005. A three-part guide to this vast literature by Catherine Beall and Herman Bratt, cited by Morton, is widely known to Rose scholars. Without rehearsing all of Jonathan Morton's arguments, I can go straight to his conclusion that, quote, its popularity with students and researchers has never been greater, and the Rose shows, quote, no sign of losing its vibrancy. Witness today. A search of the Google Scholar Citation Index shows that Morton was right. There were 4 days ago, it's probably changed now, 492 books, articles, abstracts, conference papers just in the last year alone that cite the Roman de la Rose. Some approaches of this new research include setting the Rose better in the context of other texts, Chaucer, Dante, Christine de Pizan, Ovid, Boccaccio, probing the Rose in relationship to some of today's issues, race, women, colonialism, globalism, and even older fashioned narratives such as medievalism and how the Rose relates to it. But my purpose here is not to review this scholarship. As a sort of introduction to this first conversation called Foundations and Avenues, I want to give a brief overview of 3 areas: the then of the Rose, or the foundations, the now of the Rose, or where we are today, new avenues, and the tomorrow of the Rose, or where we are or could be going. I will touch on areas such as the digital rose, the lost of the rose, lost and found, the art of the rose, lost and found roses. That will be addressed as we proceed with other conversations in the webinar. The hundreds of unique manuscripts that Stephen Nichols just called attention to mean that there can be no comprehensive study of the Rose as an entity without a database in printed and/or in digital form of the manuscripts. 2 of our speakers today have been instrumental in establishing that database. In print form, Meradith McMunn in her forthcoming book, and in digital form, as you've already heard, Stephen Nichols in the digital Roman de la Rose. The first phase of the digital Roman de la Rose was spearheaded by Stephen Nichols in 1998, when he approached the Eisenhower Library at Johns Hopkins about digitizing 3 manuscripts of the Rose for teaching purposes. manuscripts from different locations, the Walters Art Museum, the Pierpont Morgan Library, and the Bodleian. Although that is only 23 years ago, it was, shall we say, light years ago in terms of computer technology. To put the first digital rose in some perspective, the same year, 1998, also marks the founding of Google. The digital rose that you see today, uploaded in about 2008, 2009, is much different from that of 1998. It has 146 of the more than 300 manuscripts digitized, not nearly 3. And the goal is to digitize everything. There is new design, increased functionality. I'm just showing you how you can use the site, which supports research on distinct manuscripts instead of treating them as mere surrogates. This is where I will focus. Still technologically old-fashioned on the site, though useful, are the charts that take the form of Google Docs. There are 2 of them. The first, shown here, includes all the recorded manuscripts, also those lost and stolen, their location and shelf mark, and some other basic data. The second includes some physical cataloging information, origin, material, dimensions, columns, lines per page, etc. Surely plans must be underway to update these so that the material can be more readily exported into other viewers or tools. But what makes the new digital rose part of the now of the rose is its use of IIIF technology and the possibilities that technology presents. IIIF stands for International Image Interoperability Framework, that's a mouthful, which enables users to take the manifest or the information contained within it as a URL, again, unimaginable without Google, and open it in another compatible IIIF tool. Through the use of this technology, the Hopkins BNF partnership of the Digital Rose becomes part of a global initiative, of which I also want to mention 2 others that are important for Rose research. One is Biblissima. Here is just their homepage, which is a hub for digital humanities projects in France, including content from multiple institutions and critical for Rose studies because of the very large number of manuscripts that are housed in French institutions. And the second is Europana, which encourages its network of partners, libraries, archives, museums, to provide access to IIIF high quality content. Many other institutions have fallen into place in this initiative, such as the British Library, whose blog, Everything's Coming Up Roses, such a great title, heralds their digitization of 14 Rose manuscripts. The compatibility of IIIF technology with web-based image viewing software enhances the opportunities for research using digital imagery. The program that seems to be winning out in this arena is Mirador, which supports deep zoom analysis through comparison of multiple images in the same workspace and the annotation of these images. I'm thinking here of how the Google Docs could function on a Mirador platform. As the Stanford University team who developed Mirador, right, it has been developed and adopted now by dozens of libraries, museums, archives, and other cultural institutions worldwide. Without opening a Mirador page, I show you here as a screenshot multiple examples of the first images of the Rose manuscripts, the author Dreamer, from different libraries captured in a Mirador viewing platform.
I'm sorry to interrupt just now, Sandra. It's Nina. You haven't been sharing your screen, and we've been following very well along But until this part seems like it'll benefit.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
How, like, sorry, here.
No, it's been great, but it's just, but anyway, this would really,
So am I now sharing or not even now?
I'm afraid not.
Okay, share screen. So I don't actually see where that is on my thing.
Down at the
Screen.
bottom center, there should, if you hover over the bottom center of your screen, you should see share screen.
No, I don't.
Okay.
I actually don't. Bottom center.
So we'll share, so let's just, I'm sorry to have interrupted. Why don't you
No,
just,
thank you. I'm so
Okay.
sorry. I should have
Yeah.
done it at the very beginning. So go ahead. Should I
because
just-
you could continue because you were kind of in a flow, and then when you and Stephen continue the conversation, you could show key images.
Okay, that's
Okay,
fine.
sorry. Okay.
Yeah, okay. So what now? The digital is all very well and good. We've come a long way from the surrogate of the earliest digital copies, but I hope it's not beating a dead horse to insist that there are still and may forever be things that technology cannot accomplish. No matter how high quality the image is, no matter how good the zoom feature, no matter how many roses are digitized, nothing replaces the materiality, or should I say sensuality, of the manuscript book. There is the question of scale, size, and weight. Then there are the four senses other than the sense of sight: touch, hearing, smell, and taste. We are using, at Les Enluminures, videography to convey not only the sense of weight and size of the manuscript, and here I will come back to this when I can figure out how to share this, the Janson rose in relationship to the viewer, but the sense of hearing as well. The rustling of the parchment leaves, the faint odors of the ink and pigment drifting off the pages, and even the accumulated pollen and dust, the palpable sensations of stroking the thicker thin parchment, furry or smooth. To return to a debate in the 1960s about the rise of print culture, I'm thinking of the Gutenberg galaxy, I would like to quote Marshall McLuhan by way of conclusion: "The medium is still the message." Feast for the eyes, also for the ears, in the crisp turning of the parchment leaves. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So now Stephen and Sandra can engage in their conversation. So Christina, if you could spotlight Stephen.
Feast for the eyes, also.
With Sandra. Great. And
No, go ahead.
no, the floor is your guys's.
Sandra, I'm really glad that you brought up the difference between the materiality of the manuscript and the digital experience of the manuscript. I think there's a good deal of misunderstanding. Many people think it's got to be an either or that's when we started digitizing, that we were essentially doing away with the whole notion of consulting manuscripts. And that was certainly not our intention ever. What we were trying to do, as Nina pointed out at the beginning, was basically try to democratize them, because up until this point, manuscripts had not been widely available. So that we thought, and also we felt that because manuscripts weren't widely available, it privileged the critical edition, which gives an entirely different concept of what this poem is as an artifact. I mean, it makes it a unified work, which is fine. I mean, we all read it that way, and we were never meant to do away with critical editions. At the same time, we did want to show as art historians do, what the nature of the medieval artifact was. So we just thought that basically the more we could get in, the better. And secondly, we wanted to make a research tool of it as well as a pedagogical tool, because you have to ask, when you start working with digital editions, you see there's a totally different kind of set of questions that must be asked about the rows. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you.
No, yes, there's, as you know, there's a lot of debate on the relationship between the digital experience and the actual experience, even to the extent of arguing which should come first. Should everyone who looks at a digital image also have handled a manuscript first, or is it completely unnecessary? And can you, as some scholars argue, do absolutely everything from a digital image? The one thing that maybe you didn't see if in this shared screen thing is this very last slide, which I think is, can you now see my screen?
No.
Or still not?
No.
Like, really?
Still
Okay.
not. Send it to me and later on I'll show
Okay.
it.
Because we have this video clip where in the video, you can actually hear the turning of the parchment, like the fluttering of the leaves. And you know, I'm a real, as Steve knows, and as Steve is too, I mean, I'm a real manuscript person. I mean, the materiality of it can never be experienced in digital form. So, I mean, I completely agree. And I think it's, I mean, we've come such a long way. It's so different now.
But Sandra, I was fascinated by the notion of the video. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I haven't, I have to say, I haven't seen, I mean, I've seen videos of manuscripts, obviously, but I'd be interested to know what you were trying, how you are using the videos as a way of trying to make up for, wait, you can never make up for the materiality of it, obviously, but to give a sense, which ones it can't get just from working from image to image in a digital repository, but giving a sense of what it is like to be in a repository, as we all have been, as frustrating as that may be, because they're always either on strike or they're shutting down just as you're finding a perfect passage in the manuscript that you want, and then they go out to lunch and you have to come back and find your place. But the video is something new. I'd like to hear more about that.
Yeah, here I am screen sharing now. So we have a great videographer, and we did a 5-minute video. I'd be happy to send to Nina and she could forward to all of you, of this Johnson rose, which is actually the topic of my last talk. And in it, and it was in order to, as I sort of said in my presentation, give a sense of scale, the sort of, even the glistening of the gold that you don't really get no matter how good the zoom features are. And finally, this little clip. Now, Nina, now do you see my screen or not still?
We see the screen, but the things, it's not moving because Zoom does that. I'm going to send to, oh, there it goes. But I'm going to send the link right now. I have it, and I'm going to send it to all the audience.
Okay. Well, anyway, this is the like 2 minutes of it where you can actually hear the turning of the pages, although I'm talking so you can't, but Nina will send it to you. I actually think that the videos are a very good and complementary feature to something like a digital surrogate or avatar, or whatever you want to call it, just because they do attempt to sort of, let's say, reproduce the experience of the viewer with the actual manuscript.
What's good about it, at least from the little I saw in your clip, is that you get to see the volume, the size. I think one of the hardest things for students to understand is what it's like to get 350 folios bound in calf in a large quarto size edition, and having the library people deposit that in front of you and on the lectern in front of you, and then trying to figure out how you're going to get through that in however long you have at your disposal before it has to go back in again. It's like being given a huge, wonderful banquet where you may have time to nibble away at the hors d'oeuvres, but never get to the main course. But I think but that's part of the experience of these things that at least I used to feel wonderfully, the fact that you're just lost in a world, and they're presenting you with a world, and between covers, and as you flip over you get the images, you get this wonderful sense of color and the text. That's great.
Yeah, even an experienced manuscript scholar like me, and maybe I'm sure all of you have had the same experience. I mean, even if you can kind of extrapolate from how many centimeters it is, height and width, and I mean, there's not. I just saw a manuscript yesterday in New York that, although I'd seen reproductions of it, I'd even seen a video, a short video. It was so much bigger and thicker. And when I picked it up, it like weighed more than two of my cats, like it was like 25 pounds heavy. I mean, there's just nothing like the experience of being in the presence of a manuscript, and it gives you a completely different sensation and memory of it.
I remember when I had the occasion, a wonderful occasion, twice, to teach with Will Knoll, who was the curator of the manuscripts when he came to the Walters. And we taught for our graduate students and some who came from several other universities, a course on sacred and secular medieval literature in manuscripts. And every student for a semester had her or his own manuscript.
Yeah, that's great.
And they could come whenever they could make it to the Walters. That was their manuscript for the semester. And the first time these manuscripts were all brought out, you could just see the excitement of the students, but the same way the total consternation as what was forthcoming. We had some wonderful theses come out of that course.
Yeah, this is a little off the point, but it relates to the student experience. Just because that's how I feel about having, access to the real thing. We sponsor a program called Manuscripts in the Curriculum, where we send a dozen manuscripts to participating colleges and universities with the only stipulation that their students must handle them. They must use them in the classroom, manuscripts in the curriculum. So wouldn't it be great to do something like that with the Rose? Get 12 institutions to send you Rose manuscripts for your 12 students in your seminar.
With that exciting idea, Sandra and Steve, thank you very much for this first conversation, which I'm sure will continue in the general discussion after the second panel. So now we're going to turn to our second panel, a conversation titled The Digital Rose, which will be between Christine McWebb and Melanie Garcia Sympson. Christine McWebb holds the title of professor at the University of Waterloo, where she teaches at the Stratford School of Interaction Design and Business and the Department of French Studies. Professor McWebb's present research focuses mainly on the digital humanities and late medieval French literature and culture. She has written extensively on the late medieval French writer Christine de Pizan, as well as on the Roman de la Rose. She published the book Debating the Roman de la Rose, a critical anthology, Routledge 2007, reprinted in 2011, and is currently working on a monograph on the textual and iconographic discourse of alchemy in the Roman de la Rose. Further, she is the director of the MARGOT project, which publishes in enriched digital form literary and iconographic materials from the French Middle Ages and the early modern period. In conversation with her is Melanie Garcia Sympson, who is a curatorial associate at the Block Museum of Art, Northwestern University. In this role, she works on collections, information, and interpretation projects, ranging from updating cataloging standards to collaborating on the museum's digital strategy. In 2014, she earned her PhD from the University of Michigan in the history of art with their dissertation titled Experiment and Visual Transformation in Illuminated Manuscripts of the Roman de la Rose, circa 1338 to 1405. So now I'll turn things over to them both with Christine McWebb, who will get the conversation started with the presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my screen, and I would also like to thank the organizers for putting on this great webinar. I think this is such an amazing idea to spend a couple hours talking about the romance of the rose in this format. So let me just share my screen. Can you tell me if you see which view you see? Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes.
See it.
You see the slides, not my text, right?
We see the
Yes.
slides.
Okay. Okay, so I titled my presentation "The Network of the Rose" because I think the network, the idea of the network, is kind of the underlying thread of my presentation. Alongside the proliferation of digital databases and digital tools of inquiry that have shaped our research over the last 2 decades, our epistemological approach to manuscript studies and literary works of the past has also changed, as we already have seen in the 2 previous presentations. And I would also like to mention Marshall McLuhan. The medium, in other words, for us, the internet allowing for network knowledge, has enabled us to investigate large sets of data comparatively, opening the field of medieval studies to a whole new range of research inquiries. Sorry. Okay. We and the cultural assets we produce are integrated into networks. Physically, as we have seen during the pandemic, we are all connected in one way or another, for better or for worse, and virtually. Temporal and geographical contexts of production and how one work, in our case, the Roman de la Rose, fits into and relates to these contexts can now be studied thanks to the proliferation of databases, such as these ones here, Les Enluminures, e-codices in Switzerland. I'm just mentioning a few of these that are picked, Johns Hopkins, the BNF, et cetera. There are many, many more. While these databases are tied to specific institutions, be it Johns Hopkins University, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, et cetera, there is at the same time cross-fertilization between them, which I think has made this field of study so much more enriching. And I have just chosen one example where we were able to collaborate with the Digital Library of Medieval Manuscripts, where we shared a number of annotations for some of the Rose manuscripts that can now be accessed on both sides. Of course, long before digital corpora have been accessible, have we put our efforts into comparative research, where, to quote Johanna Drucker, we situate a work within the many networks from which it gains meaning and value, and then present the results within complex visual arguments. And just looking around this virtual room, so to speak, on Zoom, all of us, Meradith, Sandra, Stephen, have engaged in this kind of work. But in our earlier days, as Stephen already talked about, it looked something like this. If we weren't able to see the actual physical manuscript, we had slides, and I mean the old physical slides, on a carousel, or we had microfilms, etc. And what I'm sharing here actually is a portion of my own personal collection of floppy disks that you see, microfilms, with which I have never been able to part. So I have them in boxes. I don't really know why, but I do. I'm sure many of you have the same kind of collection. And my research assistant last summer was so in awe of this weird collection of curious objects that she decided to turn them into a design project for the MARGOT site. And so this is what she came up with. She was just absolutely marveling at this. And so this is what we have now added kind of as a little design project to the site. And then, of course, long before us, others have also engaged in inventing network technologies to enable this kind of comparative research, such as the so-called book wheel invented by Agostino Romelli that you see here. This is from the 16th century, of course, and is an early example of knowledge integration on a material pragmatic level. The wheel enabled a scholar to consult an array of volumes by placing them on rotating shelves and then turning the wheel from one volume to another, thereby allowing for a proto-hypertextual reading of pertinent texts. In theory, this was a revolutionary approach to intertextual research. In reality, of course, the wheel was a complex and rather clunky construction of gears and counterbalances that sought to make easier a process that scholars already practiced by picking up and putting down a set of books related to a common subject. Now moving on to the rows. I would like to give you just an example from my own research process where access to digital corpora of its manuscripts has become absolutely indispensable. Having all these manuscripts at our fingertips is one thing, yet extensive metadata and advanced search capabilities are what make these digital collections so useful. The image delivery API defined by the IIIF that Sandra mentioned has advanced the development of ever more sophisticated search tools, for example. And the example that you see here, I just took a screenshot of this, is where I did a character name search for the allegory of Lady Nature. And these are the results that come up. So this, of course, is absolutely crucial when you're trying to do comparative research. So within the context of my work on alchemical discourse in the rows, I looked at representations of Lady Nature. So I started big. I just, with a very general kind of a search, as you just saw in the previous slide. And I was particularly interested in her representation as a creator of new human beings. So her representation as a blacksmith, for example. After performing many different searches on the Digital Library of Medieval Manuscript site, ranging from keyword to description searches, I limited it to 14th century manuscripts, I was able to compare several of those manuscripts that depict a couple in bed to represent nature's work as a blacksmith. And the three manuscripts that I'm giving you here are the Arsenal 5209 and then the BNF 24388. And then the third one, the BNF 1565. Sorry, I'm just going back to the slide for a second. These manuscripts all belong to the N group, according to Langlois and then later on Sylvia Hewitt's classifications, and contain a noteworthy interpolation at the end of the text, which was of interest to me in the context of alchemical discourse and symbolism. I then took a closer look at these manuscripts containing this interpolation, which appears in 10 of the 14 manuscripts that make up the N group, dated around 1350 and produced in Paris. 5 of these manuscripts that contain the interpolation also contain a miniature depicting nature in her forge as a couple in bed in the act of copulation. And again, these 3 manuscripts are the same that I showed you before, that have the same text of the interpolation, which I won't get into right now because in the interest of time. But let's just say what I'm trying to show is that thanks to the capabilities of the IIIF now, I was able to conduct this kind of research, kind of like a funnel where I start out broad and then was able to narrow it down through targeted searches to come up with this result. So to be able to narrow down a large data set to 3 manuscripts, let's say, that share certain commonalities, which we're then able to analyze at a very granular level, has led to advances in our research that would have been extremely difficult and extremely costly to conduct prior to digital data sets. So by way of conclusion, I would just like to say, and this goes back to what Sandra was, and actually both Sandra and Stephen were saying, how important it is to, in addition to being able to look at digital data sets, to have the experience of handling a physical manuscript. And of course, in the absence of this, which by necessity is unfortunately the case for many of our students who don't have that opportunity, I believe that it is our task as experts in this field to convey as best as we can. And I think the video that Sandra showed was a very good example of basically recreating the experience of what it is to handle a physical manuscript. It's important for all of us to continue to lend our expertise to refine search and other tools, and to add expert content, and maybe create new technologies to experience this type of manuscript handling that comes close to at least handling a physical manuscript, because in a lot of ways, access to and availability of digital data sets has become essential to the new research questions that we are now able to posit. But at the end of the day, the expert knowledge, I believe, is still key. So I'm going to leave it at that and hand it over to Melanie. Thank you.
So does this appear correctly? I have the same question as Christine.
Yes, it does.
Okay, wonderful.
Muted.
Okay, I'm Melanie. I'm a curatorial associate at the Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University, which sits on the homelands of the Council of the Three Fires. And being part of this virtual conference is really meaningful to me, including panelists who wrote the foundational scholarship I've used, created the tools that made my dissertation possible, and are also carrying the conversation forward. So thank you for the invitation. Since finishing my art history dissertation on Roman de la Rose manuscripts, I've become more of a generalist. At the Block Museum, I focus on how we create meaningful digital encounters with the museum's holdings. And part of this shift, I think, has to do with the use of digital tools when completing the dissertation. So while I traveled extensively and viewed manuscripts in person, it wouldn't have been possible to do the comparative work and complete this project without access to the Roman de la Rose digital library and other digital tools available through the BNF, the British Library, the Morgan Library, and some of the others that Christine noted in one of her slides. And I have this title that's kind of boring, but would be good for like search engine optimization. That, you know, I'm giving like this a bird's eye view into the reflection on the process of using both art historical connoisseurship and the digital archives as resources. So when I first began to consider the Rose as a dissertation topic, I found a rich array of scholarship in French studies and literary studies, many of which incorporated illuminations into research. But I found fewer comparative or comprehensive studies in art history. And as we've heard in the first panel, there are many reasons for this. Illuminations in Rose manuscripts are not always the most refined. And I think we as art historians have a bias toward the luxury manuscripts. With respect to the practicalities of research, the corpus is so large, the illumination cycles are so varied. We don't have an original cycle and a comprehensive catalog, which will change the field that Meradith McMunn is working on, is still in the works. And so it's really difficult to make generalizations. I put two images up that were part of chapters that didn't make it to the dissertation about medieval image theory, because as I was writing those chapters, I found it hard to avoid generalized phrases like Pygmalion often appears, or sometimes, or rarely, when discussing certain illustrations of certain scenes. But yet I remained interested in what broader trends we might notice about pictorial cycles, you know, while acknowledging that each manuscript is distinct. So with that in mind, I considered how the art historical method of identifying artists' hands and workshops of illumination remains an incredibly important tool for identifying groups of manuscripts that are produced within the same milieu. So even if we no longer imagine a physical workshop with illuminators working side by side in a production line, identifying similar styles is meaningful in dating manuscripts, imagining the circumstances of their production, and making meaningful comparisons. So exploring attributions made by other art historians, I identified 3 14th century workshops that were responsible for illuminating multiple copies of the rose. Each produced the majority of images in 3 or more copies. And when using this method, it's possible to see distinct changes in the expectations of clients over time in accord with evolving attitudes toward the text and growing expectation for deluxe manuscripts. And there's much to say about the changing artistic styles over the course of the 14th century. And I'm focusing here on it's like a overview really on the total number of illuminations in each manuscript and the number of illuminations in Guillaume and Jean's respective sections. So I have more charts and graphs here than I usually would. So Marie-Thérèse Gousset and Richard and Mary Rouse have shown that the husband and wife team of Richard and Jean de Montbasson, active circa 1338 to circa 1353, produced at least 19 illustrated copies. And that's about 1/3 of their surviving oeuvre. And so this is a workshop that clearly created a niche for themselves and would have had a keen understanding of patrons' expectations at the time. And some of the findings of looking at these manuscripts as a whole and charting the pictorial cycles is that Guillaume's section has 14 to 27 miniatures, Jean's has 1 to 27 miniatures, and the total number of miniatures ranges between 16 and 51. I'll note too that there's 2 manuscripts whose location is not known. There may have been more manuscripts attributed to this workshop since writing the dissertation, but it's interesting to see the range that we have here. So certain episodes we can say were always included in manuscripts produced within this milieu. So the lover dreaming in the frontispiece, although this group has every kind of origin frontispiece or type of frontispiece, it's not, just, they didn't consistently do the same one. They have representations of the vices, the author portrait of Jean de Meun, but a lot of scenes were optional and the varying number might have depended on the list of rubrics available, the client's budget, maybe a particular interest in the text. And noteworthy is, you see this large range of illuminations in Jean's section. 9 manuscripts have fewer than 9 illuminations in his lengthy continuation. And here, for artist L of the Bible Moralisée of Jean the Good, active circa 1350 to 1365, I drew on the work of Francois Avril in terms of attributions and used his work that centered on an analysis of a highly kind of important manuscript to think about rose manuscripts. So this artist was reaching a career high point in the decade after the last mention of the Montbastons in the records of the University of Paris. And while the Montbastons dominated the Parisian market for rose manuscripts, artist L illuminated copies at a moment when the pool of available rose manuscripts had steadily increased and production was becoming more diffuse. So in Guillaume's section, we see 19 to 41 miniatures, in Jean's 20 to 21, and the total between 40 and 61. So some takeaways were the pictorial cycles produced by artist L are heavily indebted to those devised by early commercial illuminators like the Montbastons. The artist produced no manuscript with less than 40 miniatures, which seems significant. And the artist relied on and adapted available models. There was just an expectation that Jean's section would have more images for customers of this price point. And then here, I also draw again on the work of Francois Avril in terms of attributions. The Maître du Polycratique of Charles V was active 1366 to 1403, around that time. And this is on the eve of the querelle, the courtly debate around the romance. And there's at least 4 manuscripts where the artist illuminated the majority of the manuscript. We have 21 to 30 miniatures in Guillaume's section, 15 to 49 in Jean's, and the total between 40 and 70. And so the manuscripts produced by this illuminator had many miniatures that were new to the Rose corpus, especially in Jean's continuation. And the image cycles in all four highlight portions of the romance that would later raise questions regarding the morality of Jean's text. And one manuscript at the Morgan, manuscript M132, has 49 images in Jean's section. So even among the manuscripts with fewer images, all four include images at the points where Jean de Meun interjects himself into the narrative to defend himself against future detractors. Understanding Rose manuscripts through the lens of these workshops sort of helped me see the forest for the trees when writing the dissertation. Here I attempt a graph with the ranges of number of illuminations in Guillaume's section in blue, Jean's section in orange, and the total number of illuminations in gray. And the workshops for me provide a snapshot into different moments of production. So we have a workshop that dominated the market in the second quarter of the 14th century here with a great, like the length of the bar shows the kind of amount of variation. We have an illuminator in the third quarter of the 14th century who relied on earlier pictorial cycles and met an expectation for more images in Jean's section. So consistently including about 20 images, which is interesting in terms of production. And a workshop in the second half of the 14th century who not only included more images in Jean's section, but also kind of included compositions that were new, highlighting his defense of the text. And even just seeing this concrete story where using these workshops as snapshots, the major trend in the number of images in Jean's section driving up the total number of images in the manuscripts. So my conclusion, I'm going to echo some of what Christine mentions about expertise. So digital archives and resources provide unprecedented access to Rose manuscripts, making new insights possible. And I really admire how sites allow users to search across manuscripts by narrative section and allow comparisons between different visualizations of the text, as you could see with the last presentation. But I'm currently thinking about how we integrate foundational art historical scholarship. Linking manuscripts illuminated by the same workshop digitally could reveal a great deal about the histories of their production, as well as the textual reception at a given moment. And working on digital projects myself now, I'm so sympathetic and understand the challenges of integrating our work. There's image rights, we have staff capacity, scholar capacity to make time to lend their free labor to these projects. But I'm echoing this idea that the metadata really is what allows for these meaningful comparisons, not simply the access, right? It's what allows us to narrow down and make meaningful comparisons.
Terrific, thank you. So now we'll listen in on a conversation between Christine and Melanie.
Hey, Christine.
Hi, I'm actually, can I pick up on what you said at the end?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very interested in, I mean, obviously the traditional art historical methods to identify artists' hands, for example, or workshops of illumination are very useful even today, but I'm just wondering, with digital tools and technologies available to us now, can you talk a little bit about what is possible that was not possible before in terms of, let's say, identification of hands? So I'm thinking, that's not even digital technology, but multispectral imaging, for example, right? So, or is there something else that you could share with us?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm curious what other people in this virtual Zoom room could lend to that, because you know, most of the multispectral imaging projects I'm aware of focus on how it can tell you the object history, the process of creating the object, but I'm trying to think of kind of projects that focus on identifying hands, scribal hands or artistic hands. And I think it's like it's a slippery slope, right? Too. I mean, because I work in a museum now, and I'm thinking, you know, what would we say if people in, I'm thinking of collaborations with math or science departments or big data departments said, well, we've actually determined that these works are by different people, or this isn't a Rembrandt or whatever. And I think, so I'm not aware of projects that are kind of taking that approach. And I also think it's one of these things, there's been discussions about the limits of the digital, and computers are only as smart as we make them. So it would take someone with expertise tagging enough images that say this is, you know, artist L or whatever, and then the computer becomes smart enough. And I'm not sure if anyone's doing that. It's a
Yeah, I can't, I would, who knows, but I would have a hard time imagining machine learning being applied to this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's true.
I have a question for you, which I loved your, the image of your slides and floppy disks and analog materials. And I'm wondering, you know, if the way you choose your comparisons change with the digital. You gave us an example at the end. And I'm also curious about if the digital allows for the same kind of serendipitous discovery that kind of shuffling through your slides or kind of allows.
I actually think it allows for much more serendipity, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's as you probably also know, trying to compare physical manuscripts with one another. I mean, like it takes such a long time, right? Because you have to change locations, and I mean, it's just complicated and expensive. And then having slides or microfilms, etc., makes it, I guess, easier, but it's still very clunky, or used to be very clunky as a technology. And I don't know about you or others, but I tended to do a lot of preliminary work. Like Stephen was saying, you know, you go to a manuscript library and you have to know exactly what you're doing because you don't want to waste your time, right? So there wasn't really much room for serendipity, I would say, whereas now I have to say, especially like when you use this method that I was talking about, where you start with a broad search and then you narrow it down. I came across so many elements of Rose manuscripts that I had been aware of and I had seen before, but I was never able to put them in the kind of context with a particular manuscript that perhaps I hadn't seen, right? But I mean, when you pull up, let's say, the first search that I showed, which was the character search for, I just put in Lady Nature. There were, I can't remember how many manuscripts came up on the site, on the Johns Hopkins site, but there were many that I hadn't consulted. And then as you go through them, you discover elements of the manuscript that you had not been aware of, right? Which is just simply impossible to do in the physical, or even with microfilms and things like that. It's just, unless you have, I don't know, 5 lifetimes and you know, it's just not possible to do. So from that perspective, I actually find it, I find it better and much more exciting to work like that, for sure. Yeah, no question about it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a really practical question here. I don't know if you have the answer to this, but as you were talking about, especially the Richard and Jean de Montbaston's atelier, and then the artist L, you know, there were 3 manuscripts in his atelier, but nonetheless, I mean, we always talk about the Romance of the Rose as a bestseller in terms of, you know, the number of surviving manuscripts and things like that. But I'm just wondering if it was also a bestseller for economical reasons. So for example, did Illuminators realize that there was money to be made at, for example, a time of political debate, moving towards the debate of the Romance of the Rose, right? In the latter part of the 14th century. So do we have any insights into this? So in other words, how lucrative it would have been for illuminators to do this kind of work I guess at that particular time?
Yeah, there may be others who in the Q&A or chat have thoughts about this. I guess, my thought is that, during this time, during certain time period, like the time period of Richard and Jean de Montfaucon, they clearly were comfortable illuminating relatively new texts. Like we can also see that in their oeuvre, and they're comfortable with experimenting and tailoring to different audiences, and that was probably appealing to people. They were also the libraire, so the bookseller, which means they would have been making, more off of the commission than someone who was just an illuminator, and that they owned, a small house in Paris. They made enough to do that. I don't know exactly, how much they were getting paid for that work, but I'm glad that you picked up on this kind of, I really come from a place of wanting to understand the makers and seeing where their innovation was, especially in this moment where it's like such a clearly popular text and recognized as such a phenomenon, I think, in your field. But I think in art history, because they aren't the most beautiful, we often don't know who the patron is, or have a name for the artist. They don't, and for reasons I also talked about, we just don't have a way of talking about the kind of, I want to say, how carefully they were thinking about themselves and their marketing, and how the works themselves kind of show that.
I wonder if this would be, I don't know, maybe this is going to give Stephen some ideas for the Johns Hopkins side, but this would be a super useful and very, very interesting project to include information on workshops, on illuminators workshops, for example, into the manuscript descriptions that would then be searchable as well, because it would give us much more insight comparatively how even the illuminators work with one another, right?
Right, even if they do have funny names and aren't like real, personality, that they were linked in their production in some way.
I think that's a perfect example of how these conversations are generating new ideas. I know they're doing it for you and for us as well. This is sort of also a perfect time to transition over to our second group of panel discussion. So I'll turn things over now to Nina, but before I do so, I'll thank you both, I'm sure for all of us as well, for such a lively conversation.
Thank you. And okay, can I embiggen myself? Okay. So Christina, could you make me large? Because what we're going to do now is, I'm afraid we're going to hold off on questions until the final part of our program today, because we need to keep things moving, and we are come to this section of our program that is on the art of the rose. And so I would like to introduce our speakers in this section. First, we will have Jonathan Morton. Jonathan is an associate professor of French at Tulane University in New Orleans and a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He is the author of The Roman de la Rose in its philosophical context, Art, Nature, and Ethics, published with Oxford University Press in 2018. And he's co-editor of The Roman de la Rose and 13th Century Thought, published with Cambridge University Press in 2020. And then our other speaker in this conversation is Elina Gertsman. Elina is professor of medieval art and Archbishop Paul J. Hallinan Professor in Catholic Studies II at Case Western Reserve University. In addition to publishing numerous articles and edited collections, she has authored The Dance of Death in the Middle Ages, Image, Text, and Performance, published in 2010, Another book, Worlds Within, Opening the Medieval Shrine Madonna, published in 2015. The Middle Ages in 50 Objects, and that was co-written with Barbara Rosenwein and published in 2018. And hot off the press, The Absent Image, Lacunae in Medieval Books, published in 2021. And she is at the moment co-writing 2 books, one on abstraction in medieval art and another on hybrid imagery in Hebrew manuscripts. And so we can welcome first Jonathan, and then we'll have Elina. And I think that issues that will touch on may also connect back to what Christine and Melanie were talking about at the end there, the popularity of this text and in its sort of its richness and weirdness in its moment. But I mean, I don't know what, I'm going to leave it to Jonathan and Elina to do their thing. So.
Hi, and so thank you, first of all, to Nina and to Sandra for organizing this event. And thank you all for coming. So I've got a few images that I'm going to talk about briefly. And so the first thing I want to say is that I'm not an art historian. So I've obviously, my work has benefited hugely from the work of the Digital Rose Project and from, and there's no way really to work on the Romance of the Rose, on the poetry of it, without thinking about the manuscript context and about the illuminations. But what I want to talk about for the next sort of 7 minutes or so is the question of what the rose itself says about art. And the rose itself is obviously what that is kind of impossible to say. But what I mean to say is that what does the poetry of the rose say about art? And so I'm going to do that and then maybe offer a couple of thoughts about the state of the field and where it might go. So the first thing that I want to say is that the rose itself, both parts of the rose, both that of Guillaume de Loris, the first part, which I think sees more study, the literature sees more study than perhaps in proportion to its importance in the rose than maybe it should. So both Guillaume de Loris and Jean Domain, both of their sections really think very closely about what is art, what does it mean for art to be in a book, and what is the relationship between image and text, but also between image and voice. And actually, as Sandra was showing the video of this kind of multimodal, multimedia way, a video that tells you like how touch and the touch and sound are fundamental aspects of how a text works. It's also one thing that one slight concern that I often have when engaging with historians of art is thinking about how these books would also have been read out loud, and there's an extra kind of sensory experience, which is the performance of these books. And so the images and text are also incitements to interpret and to perform. But so that's maybe a slightly more theoretical question, but I want to talk about a few images, and these are images whose analysis was really made possible thanks to the Digital Rose Project. And so these both come from Guillaume de Loris's part of the Romance of the Rose. And so we have the dreamer who's walking outside of the Garden of Delight, where you have all of these allegorical images represented. So here is avarice. In fact, these are 2 images of avarice painted on, who are sculptures or painted on the walls of the garden. And so both of these, so the text itself suggests itself for illumination by saying there were pictures painted on the garden wall, and so the garden wall becomes, and the pictures also have text on them, so the garden wall becomes a doubling of the page. So we have the lover walking around looking at these allegorical images, reading the text, just as a reader would be opening the book and looking at the allegorical images and reading the text. And so here are 2 different ways of dealing with that, this kind of the thinking about the relationship between art and book. And on the one on the right, the London manuscripts, well, I mean, they're all made in Paris, but we have the page itself is a double, right? So here's the wall, the parchment is also the wall. We have the figure of avarice and we have her name underneath, so we know who she is. whereas in the manuscript that's now in Valencia, we have a doubling. We have an attention to the fact that we are looking at a representation of art. And so there is this self-consciousness about that this is a text that only exists in a book form. And this goes back to what Stephen was saying about the idea that the printed modern edition does not give you a sense of the complex negotiations that are a fundamental part of this poem, which was written to be not just one, but to be multiple works of art. And so this is a work that was made to be kind of multiple always. And I'm going to come back to that. And so another image I'd quite like to talk about is, so this is more Jean de Main. So Jean de Main does something really, I mean, as with all of these things, it does just, as someone who's spent too much time thinking about Jean de Main, it always makes me a bit sad when Guillaume de Loris gets given more emphasis than Jean, because while Guillaume de Loris is maybe, the second most interesting poet in the 13th century, Jean de Main is by far and away the most interesting. And he thinks about, so this is a text that thinks about art. And so Pygmalion is a figure of a creator who has fallen in love with a text through his perverse desire. And you can see the sculptor who is hammering a very phallic chisel into the slowly emerging body of the work of art. And so Pygmalion is a figure both for the lover, but also for the poet. And there is a sense in which the Romance of the Rose is putting forward an idea of the poet as an artist, and the artist potentially as a kind of poet. There's a similar kind of poesis and making. And so, and this is one of the things that I think comes out most clearly. I'm going to talk about two more images, and then I want to talk briefly about the state of the field and where I think it might go. Okay, so this is Pygmalion. But I mean, my favorite image, and this is the one that I chose for the cover of my monograph, which is Nature at her forge. And Christine McWebb already showed a couple of images of a more literal illumination of this scene. So Nature at her forge hammers human beings and other creatures into existence. And that is the kind of the most natural, in the sense of natural linking to birth, the most natural process of nature, of creating new life, is represented here as art. And so you can see these kind of creepy little half-made dolls in the corner. And so this is an act, the hammer is supposed to represent male genitals, the anvil is female genitals. And so what you have here is both a representation of art and a representation of sex. And what it does, I think, is it really puts the emphasis on the fact that the only way of getting to any kind of truth in this text, if there is any, is through art. And then art becomes this kind of broad category that is both, as I said, both poetry and also making. Okay, so actually, just to go back 1 second. So one of the things that is coming up is that this is a representation of a kind of technology and a technology of making. I mean, in this case, it's a hammer and anvil, but here is another, this is an image that was shown before. This is another aspect of technology, of a technology of making books. So this is thought to be, this is an interpretation that I'd go along with. This is a manuscript made by the workshop of Jeanne and Richard de Montbasson. And this is, in theory, an autobiographical image made by Jeanne of her and him in their workshop. And there were debates about this, but the point that I want to raise about this image is that it offers a way in which someone like Jeanne, particularly, as someone who had not necessarily read the whole of the text. So between her and her husband, they would have produced, we have about 19, I think, manuscripts extant, but they would have had, you can see these pages hanging up to dry, the different of manuscripts, and they would have read bits of it. They would have had this kind of partial, fractional view of the rose. And that, I think, is possibly the most true idea that one can have of what it's like to read the rose, because this is where I'm going to talk very briefly about my own take on it and how I see the field, particularly in relation to the digital movement. So interpreting this, looking at the question of whether Jeanne de Montbazon could actually have interpreted the rose, one critic said of her that she could not have had the knowledge of an omniscient literary critic. Now, as someone who is more or less a literary critic, the idea that I would be omniscient or that someone who's an expert in literature would be omniscient is kind of laughable. This text is so complex and so huge that it's impossible to get a handle on. And this is where both the digital rose is so important, and where I'm not sure that I'm capable of saying where I think the field is going. So I've tried to kind of emphasize the ideas in the rose and the philosophy of the rose and how it engages with the debates in the 13th century. And I find myself thinking about what comes next. I'm lost because so many people are doing so much new stuff. And in that sense, the internet is the most appropriate resource for dealing with a field that is sprawling and a text that is sprawling. I would not say that the rose helps us understand the internet better, but certainly the other way around. And so I think I'm going to stop there. One thing I do want to stress is just how exciting the Digital Rose project is, and the kind of analysis that I've just carried out here, I would not have been able to do without access, even as a literary scholar, without access to the digital resources there. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Should I just go ahead and begin, Nina?
Yes, yeah, you're on, Elina.
All right. My Zoom is freezing up, so who knows what you're about to see. What are you seeing? Are you seeing my PowerPoint or nothing? It's frozen.
We see screen sharing.
And nada.
No, I'm afraid not.
Unbelievable.
There you go. Yep,
it's
good.
green. Okay, glorious. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. All right then. So thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. And I realize that I'm the only not Roman de la Rose specialist here, so it's doubly lovely and marvelous to learn from all of you. And I have been thinking about the now and the future of the rose ever since the invitation, but because I saw so many PhD students and graduate students in general in the list of attendees, I thought that maybe a brief excursus into historiography might be useful. And we've heard, bits of it, already in the few conversations. But for those art historians in particular who are somewhat, new to the field, it might be useful to think about what we have done already and where our interests have been, and then maybe chart some possibilities about where we might go. So we know, of course, right, that the field has, in writing about Roman de la Rose, art historians have focused, aside from questions, right, of patronage and workshops, we focused on iconography. We looked at specific figures, right? It's for Semblant, we have literary and art historians present here who have written on for Semblant and Oiseuse and Dangier, so on these discrete specific figures. But the bulk of the scholarship, I think, has been particularly compelling, that's focused on images within images. And this is what Jonathan just started talking about, precisely this idea that an image within an image has its own agency. So we looked at the images on the garden wall, and I won't repeat what Jonathan just said, but there's a very nice string of scholarship dealing with those, these images that act like human beings, the images of Zeuxis drawing the nudes, the images of nature. I'm sorry, I'm bringing out the same manuscript that Jonathan just did. So images of nature at her forge creating, now I will never be able to say babies, I just think of those broken dolls. Thank you very much. Related to that, we have focused a lot on the imagery of Pygmalion forging his sculpture, whose agency and life force lived out, whether she's an image at all. And of course, images on the altar within the Pygmalion sequence. So images within images discoursing on the agency of images, as it were. We've looked at images of Narcissus, whose story, as told by Guillaume de Loris, is considered as a pendant to the story of Pygmalion, as told by Jean de Meun, the best poet of his century, of course, and whose reflection, which is itself an image, is seen as a self-referential comment on the nature of the artist's craft. And Pygmalion's story in particular, right, it comes back to haunt us all the time. It's been explored. It's been used exactly to explore this nature of the artist as a forger, as a creator, as a self-aware craftsman, writing his own identity across these images. And I'm thinking of Marion Blakey's wonderful article on that argued that manuscripts, in this particular manuscripts, the narrative arc that shifts agency from the sculptor, who first lords it over Pygmalion, to Pygmalion, who subsequently lords it over the sculpture, reflects the changing status of the artist in the 15th century and the late medieval, early modern shift of focus from the work of art to its creator. And of course, we have Melanie Sympson here. And so I'm thinking about the way that art historians have stepped into debates on the role of images and the proposed literacy of the Rose's illuminators, their engagement with patrons and planners, on the relationship between words and images. Did the images gloss or subvert the Rose's narrative? Did they structure an entirely different narrative on their own? What are the mechanics of the structure? Are these images self-referential? Do they comment on the viewer's very perception? And here, of course, right, Pygmalion comes to the fore and Narcissus comes to the fore. And I'm thinking of Anne Harris's wonderful piece that draws this compelling contrast between the contemplative visual mode invited by the leisurely mise-en-page between Narcissus and the lover on the early pages of this manuscript, and then the active visual mode, this comic strip-like mode, the rapid reading that is conditioned by, again, rapid-fire arrangement of the images of Pygmalion. So you did not invite me here, however, to just talk about the past studies, and you really asked me to talk about the future possibilities of working on these manuscripts. And when I was thinking about this task, I found myself considering that we might do well in picking up these very same research threads and taking them into some different directions. So an endeavor that will now be made so much easier thanks to the extraordinary Digital Rose project. So more broadly, in a broad sense, picking up the word image thread, we might wish to think of Roman de la Rose imagery in terms of visual difficulty, of a difficult reading as a guiding principle. So something that Jonathan has done in his work. What do we do when linear narrative comes up against non-linear comprehension, when images that subvert and complicate what is already learned through these very same images? When we try to grasp meaning against or with this helix of significations and what Suzanne Lewis has called extratextual semantic code. The difficult reading in terms of visual modes of transmission of knowledge that spur on the struggle to negotiate between what is represented, what is written, what is known, and what is imagined. More specifically, picking up the iconographic vision perception thread, I thought we might think about some unexpected visual elements. For instance, one of my PhD students, Dominique De Luca, just defended a splendid dissertation on the role of shadows in late medieval manuscripts. And she's currently completing a book whose third chapter is dedicated to the Vienna manuscript of the Rose. And she found that the text, which of course contains multiple references to shadows, and the images in that manuscript, and sometimes, and this is something maybe we can talk about, in conjunction with real shadows cast on the book by the viewer, that this confluence foregrounds the shadows association with concealment, deception, and violence. So she found scores of images that engage with this concept of liminality and shadow, starting with the opening miniature that you see here, where Armand, casting a shadow on the back of his chair, sits against the room where the bed is plunged into shadows, and there's a shadow that darkens the doorway that separates Armand's room or his waking state from the dream world. And it's a liminal space. It's liminal in terms of perception and vision, and in terms of being, and in terms of the dream as described in the text itself, because once Armand emerges in the open space, his body no longer casts a shadow. Perhaps an indication of the revelation of those hidden things, right? Of this emergence, the passing from the natural world, as De Luca says, of his room into the dreamscape, right, into this landscape of his dream. So perhaps another research route that I was thinking about our historians can take, and has been exemplified recently in this thesis completed by Elizabeth Olsen at Edinburgh, is to look at the transitions between the material and the visionary, and the liminality of dream scenes as sites of in-betweenness, as it were, to look for these indices of unreliability, fallibility of vision and dream, and implied visual failures. Or perhaps, I thought, we can look at the traces of haptic engagement with the Roman de la Rose manuscripts, and haptic engagement has become a sweetheart of art history lately, right? But we can look at these manuscripts to explore their patterns of multisensory reading. In the same, in this manuscript, for example, we find distinctive traces of use, none the more obvious than the erased face of genius, to whom nature confesses. So this erasure is targeted, it is specific, just genius's face with some smear on his cloak. And I have explored such targeted erasures elsewhere, suggesting that they become their own image, that their new meanings are constructed through obliteration. So what kind of an image is being constructed here? Does it participate in the notion of the difficult reading? Or perhaps I had a thought that this same image can be mined for the concept of abstraction. So this is the only miniature in the manuscript that boasts reticulated background. All the other scenes are set against lively landscapes. When Nikki was working on her dissertation, this moment of conjunction between reticulated background and landscape jumped at her, and we were wondering, here we have this terrestrial greenery come up against non-representational geometry, and why here? Does this image participate in the complex visual and philosophical conversations on abstractive modes of seeing? Current during the time this manuscript was illuminated, right? In the 15th century, it was a hotbed of discussion on abstractive thinking. Does it stand, as it often does, for an epistemological gap? Does it index the unrepresentable? You know, in this case, perhaps the nature of nature's confession. So this issue of unrepresentability, unrendability, I think would make a really interesting field of inquiry. And I'm looking at the time, and I think I just tried your patience enough. So I will stop share, and I will look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
That's terrific. And presentations from both Jonathan, Morton, and Elina. And so now I'd like to, yes, give you guys a chance to have some conversation, and we'll go for about 10 minutes, and then we'll move on. So questions from one another. Yeah.
I mean, we have to talk about unrepresentability a little bit. I feel that this is the shared interest, and not just unrepresentability in terms of, you know, image within image. How do you render art image through image? But what do we do conceptually when something that is being described at length and in depth and a detail that is mind-boggling, what do we do with it image-wise?
So I think this is kind of where the role of, I'm going to use art in a broader context, as I was doing in my talk, rather than just visual representative art, where I think this is one of the things that the Romance of the Rose does. It says, well, let's take an impossible question, like what is design? what is love? I mean, what is love? If there's any question that the rose is, it's what is love? And there is no scope really to get to the grips of erotic desire, which is kind of fundamentally irrational in medieval, a lot of medieval takes on it. And so here's an impossible question. Talking about it literally is not going to work. Therefore, you have to use art. You have to use allegory. You have to talk about things that gesture towards something unspeakable, which is kind of how allegory works in certainly verbal allegory. And I think that so the rose itself is an attempt to answer questions that cannot be answered. And so of course it's going to fail, and it has to fail. And I suppose one of the things that I feel that the rose is a big pioneer in is something that is the idea that it forces you to continue the conversation. So because every answer you can give to an impossible question will be insufficient, the readers or the audiences or the listeners or the artists are repeatedly interpolated to continue to supplement the question, sorry, to supplement the insufficient answer to the always unanswerable question.
So then it participates in this whole extraordinary work, right? Body of work on insufficiency and on some, and we don't think of secular romances like Roman de la Rose, and I know I'm using the word secular very broadly, but we think of devotional treatises doing that work, that prompts, right? The poke at the reader and the poke at the viewer, and then you go ahead and finish, and you go ahead and develop it. But here what you're saying is that the text of this, right, of this work is doing exactly the same thing within a completely different context.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is fascinating. So, well, what do we do then about, right, so I want to go back to what you said at the beginning, which is, we have these, right, unrepresentable concepts, and Rose is so good at messing with you and with your unrepresentability. Sorry, I'm like on my 4th hour of talking of unrepresentability. And that, there is this gap, how do you go about visualizing it? But what do we say when we think that every image is a gap? There is always a gap between what is even everything absolutely specific, everything iconographically stable. There is a gap between that and the image. What do we do with the image as it were twice removed? Where now, how do you make that difference?
I mean, if I had an answer to that,
just as a discussion. No.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, this is in fact staged at the end of the rose. As the lover goes into layer after layer of kind of metaphor to get to the middle. So he tries to penetrates jealousy's castle where the rose is being kept, and he goes through the crumbling walls, and then he goes through there's a hole that he has to get through, and then there's an opening with a curtain, and he's trying to get through these layers and layers of meaning, and you get to the end, and there's a flower, and there's no meaning beyond it necessarily. And so I take a slightly I take a very pessimistic view of the idea that you can get anywhere. So
agreed.
But I think this is also, I think this is recognized in the Middle Ages, which is why so many of the responses to the rose are themselves also allegories, because they've recognized. I mean, this is the kind of thing that Jean Gerson in The Quarrel Over the Rose recognizes. I mean, he gets the rose, he hates it, but he understands that it's incredibly dangerous and subversive in that sense. I have a question for you actually, Elina, which is I'm really struck by what you're talking about. The images themselves are also difficult to read, and the idea of difficulty seems to me a really valuable place where art history and literary history can really be put into fruit. I mean, maybe as we're demonstrating, can be put into like a fruitful dialogue. And I agree that could be a really interesting way for new directions. But I was wondering what do, and this is too big a question, what do art historians do with the poetry of the rose? And because there's so much, because I've had the sense sometimes that people don't necessarily read it And that's maybe okay, but I was wondering, what do you do when you're faced with something like this? How do you deal with it?
So I would hope that we do read it, you know, and I will answer this. So again, I think that there are colleagues in the session that will answer it in a much more profound way, because I teach the rows, and I can tell you that my students read the rows and they hate the rows because it is so difficult and it is frustrating. And the end of it is just so foul, especially when you look at the manuscripts that I show them. And the manuscripts finish, or images finish the unfinished, right? You know, you're telling me that he's penetrating and penetrating, and there is the rose, and then you're looking at the accompanying image, and he is penetrating and penetrating, and there he stands with his, you know, shaft inside the space and with his pilgrimage sack hanging behind. I mean, right, it is not a rose that he is gazing upon. So we do read the text, and I think this is the place where, right, interdisciplinarity is glorious and has its pitfalls. How well do we do it? You know, how well do literary historians really look at the images, and how well do art historians actually look at the text? And I'm sure that we're all very frustrated with each other very often, and then we get excited very often. So I think that the texts get read, and what that brief overview that I gave at the beginning, I think points to the directions where we shift, right? The image within the image, the agency of the image. What work does the image do in conjunction to the text? What are the gaps between what is written and what is represented? How does that construct its meaning? So, you know, Suzanne Lewis has written about it quite a bit. And that, I find myself teaching a lot through those gaps between what we read and what we see, and where they, you know, butt up against each other. And that's not it's an old methodology to do that, right? But that would probably be my answer for you. I have also, can I just ask a very quick question, because I know we're probably running out of time, because you mentioned Jean Gerson, and I've been meaning to ask this, and this might be a completely ridiculous question. So we talk a lot about indeterminacy, right? That the work seems, it just ends, and you know, the first part of it just ends, and then Jean de Meun picks it up, and then that just suddenly abruptly ends, and it's built itself on this indeterminate, not quite, you reader finish it, you viewer finish it. But then when in the 15th century, 14th, 15th century, they're writing about this, it seemed like they thought it was pretty bloody finished. And they knew exactly what it was, and you could love it or you could hate it. But, you know, like you think of Christine de Pizan and you think of Jean Gerson, and they thought they totally figured out exactly what it was about. So how do we negotiate those gaps? Is it because these are just dominant voices that they're authoritative voices?
So I would hate to talk about this too much in the presence of Christine McWebb, who is the person to really go to about the debate about the Romance of the Rose, who can, I'm sure, answer this with much greater authority than I can. But I mean, in terms of the Rose's supporters, the Jean de Montreuil and the Cole brothers, I'm not sure that. I mean, I'm not sure they necessarily appreciated its indeterminacy in the way that Gerson did. I mean, Gerson, one of the problems he has with it is the fact that all these different voices make it impossible to get an authority, and that's why it's so hateful, in part to him. That's one of the reasons. I think he calls it something like a German broth. It's like you can't unpack it. You can't work out who's responsible for anything, which is kind of which is kind of part of the problem when you have a multi-authored page, a multi with many artists and many authors, is what you choose to read and how you choose to read it. And I wonder if, going back to your response to my previous question, is that one of the things that really comes up, particularly with the Rose, it wants you to think about what it means to read. And I think when you bring different disciplines, like reading as an art historian, reading as a literary historian, I've spent the last 10 years in a kind of futile quest to try and read the Rose as an intellectual historian. And one of the questions that comes up is, what does it mean to read? And of course, in a digital age, what does it mean to read in a digital age is obviously very different to what it means to read in an age of print or in an age of manuscript production. So yeah.
While we'll think about it in terms of what does it mean to see and what does it mean to perceive. Oh.
Okay, and I'm so sorry to jump in. There's so many great ideas now that have been stewing, and a lot of them connect back actually again to the stuff that Christine McWebb and Melanie were talking about the popularity of this. I really find myself wondering also about the elements in it, that how it was performed or read, and what Jonathan thinks about that. We've also gotten a question, but we need to move on, and maybe we can get to all of these things in a final discussion at the end. But now we can think about our final speakers, who will be talking about lost and found roses, which calls attention to the fact that these manuscripts continue to be mesmerizing and compelling for audiences to the present day. And you will hear about that from our two speakers, Dr. Meradith McMunn being the first one. Meradith is the Mary Tucker Thorp College Professor and Interdisciplinary Professor of Medieval Studies Emerita at Rhode Island College, Providence, Rhode Island. She has published on medieval bestiary manuscripts and has made a particular study of the manuscripts and fragments of the Old French Roman de la Rose with an emphasis on the iconography of the illustrations. And then the second speaker in this final section will be, again, Sandra Hyndman, and I will read again her bio for those tuning in late. Sandra is president and founder of the gallery Les Enluminures, founded 30 years ago, and is now with branches in Chicago, New York, and Paris. Sandra is also Professor Emerita of Art History at Northwestern University and previously taught at the Johns Hopkins University. She is author, editor, and co-author of more than a dozen books on medieval manuscript illumination, early printing, medieval and Renaissance rings. And so now, and she is also, of course, a co-organizer of this afternoon's discussion. So I am now going to present Meradith's, offer Meradith's presentation. And, but Meradith, you can unmute yourself. Please bear with me while I do this. Okay.
Okay. My interest in the manuscripts of the Roman de la Rose began in the 1980s when I fell in love with the Rose miniature paintings and realized that no two manuscripts that I examined were exactly alike, even though said to be copies of each other or of a common source. I decided to make a complete list of the extant Rose manuscripts, to look at each for detailed codicological study, and to catalog the iconography of the illustrations. In this quest, I have seen Rose manuscripts in public and private collections and auction sales houses. In pursuit of a complete inventory, I have traced the history of ownership of each manuscript where possible. Along the way, some manuscripts have been lost and found again as they move from one owner to another. Two excellent resources for researchers are romandelarose.org, now called DLMM, the Digital Library of Medieval Manuscripts at the Johns Hopkins University Library, and the Schoenberg Database of Medieval Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania Library. The question I am most often asked is, how many manuscripts the Roman de la Rose exist? At present, I know of 328 manuscripts, of which 253 are or were planned to be illustrated. Among them are 55 fragments, 15 of which are illustrated, though many existing unillustrated fragments may have come from illustrated manuscripts. For example, I have argued on the basis of a choir signature and other characteristics of an unillustrated rose fragment in Asti, Italy, that this fragment must have come from an illustrated codex. Lost manuscripts. Manuscripts and fragments of manuscripts may be lost under several different circumstances, and the loss may be permanent or temporary. But as the character Laura Croft in Tomb Raider says, Everything lost is meant to be found. Permanent losses of entire Rose manuscripts occur when the manuscripts are destroyed, often the result of war or library fire. 2 Rose manuscripts were completely incinerated in 1904 in the disastrous fire at the Turin National University Library. Other manuscripts, such as the Loire fragment and the Falaise Rose, were destroyed in World War II bombardments. Unfortunately, we have no photographs or detailed descriptions of any of these destroyed manuscripts. I now appeal for photographs and detailed descriptions to be made of all Rose manuscripts and fragments, and these should be freely available to all researchers. Many extant Rose manuscripts of the Rose have suffered partial losses. Here, left and center, are 2 examples of cutout pictures from a single leaf in Princeton and a codex in Dijon. The page from Paris on the right exemplifies 2 types of loss. This manuscript, with 40 remaining leaves of at least 104 original leaves, is missing its first quire and its last 7 quires. All the miniatures on the remaining leaves have been treated with a chemical reagent, probably intended to brighten the colors. However, the long-term effect has been to darken the images so that they are nearly illegible, even with strong backlighting. Stolen manuscripts are lost, but hopefully may be found again. On the left is a Rose manuscript stolen from the public library in St. Helier, Jersey in 1955. Yes.
Is that right?
Right.
Okay, sorry.
Fortunately, a local historian had earlier made glass plate negatives of most of the miniatures in the manuscript. I think we're still a little out of.
Is this the correct image?
No, I skipped a paragraph.
Oh, okay.
Let's go back to that and I'll give you the, okay. The inserted miniature covering the cutout hole in the Bernard Héron Rose is clearly not the original illustration of Raison indicated by the rubricated caption, visible, just barely visible, above the insert. The source manuscript of this substituted illustration may yet be identified. Now, next. Stolen manuscripts are lost, but hopefully may be found again. On the left is a Rose manuscript stolen from the public library in St. Helier, Jersey in 1955. Fortunately, a local historian had earlier made glass plate negatives of most of the miniatures in the manuscript. See my article in Scriptorium for details. On the right is a Rose manuscript, which was photographed while on deposit at the Bodleian Library. It was later stolen in 1997 from the collection of Dr. Helmut Beck at his home in Stuttgart. Both of these manuscripts are well known and readily identifiable from the photographs, and they are therefore unlikely to appear on the open market anytime soon. An example of a theft and a later recovery of a Rose manuscript is that of the 6-leaf illustrated fragment from the Butler Library at Columbia University. The story of how the thief broke into the rare books section of the library is well told by Travis McDade in The Book Thief. I'm delighted to say that my persistence in inquiring about the Rose fragment helped support the judge's ruling for a longer than standard jail sentence for the convicted thief. Peter Kidd has shown that the Rose frontispiece on the right, recently added to the Robert McCarthy fragment collection, is on the missing bifolium comprising leaves 1 and 8, which originally enclosed the 6 leaves at Columbia. Sandra Hyndman will discuss another lost and found manuscript, the Janson Rose. Found manuscripts. Previously undocumented manuscripts of the Rose appear every few years. The codex, now in Toronto, first came to light in an auction sale in 1994. It was bought by a private collector and sold again in 2016 to Professor Scott Wara, who in turn sold to the University of Toronto Fisher Library. The Fraise sale in 2018 included a Rose manuscript with paintings by Richard de Montbaston. This manuscript had made only one previous appearance in a printed record. In Manuscripts and Their Makers, Richard and Mary Rouse identified the painter and the choir structure, but did not list or describe the individual illustrations. The manuscript is now in a private collection in Europe. Finally, I am currently working on a project to digitally reunite several fragments of an illustrated Rose manuscript, now in 2 separate repositories and not previously identified as related to each other. What can we do to further advance research and discoveries concerning Rose manuscripts? We should identify, analyze, and compare the text and illustrations of individual manuscripts and fragments, as well as their material support.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meredith. And now we will have Sandra. Sandra, are you there?
And start video. The host does not start my video. The host has, there, now, wait, there. Share screen. Think I can do that now? Can
Great.
you?
Yep. Do it in slide mode, slideshow. Yeah.
Oops. That, I want to go back. Oh. There. Everything fine? This time you can see my screen. Can you hear me too?
Yes, we can see and hear.
Okay. In her fascinating presentation, Meredith McMunn left out, although she just mentioned one manuscript, the Janson Rose. The manuscript appears in the Google Doc corpus of extant manuscripts of the digital Rose as number 318, marked location unknown and identified as Sir Jacob Astley Bart Marcel Janson, last seen 20 years ago at Christie's in London. In fact, this rose also fits in the lost and found category, so intriguingly outlined by Meredith. After the sale, the manuscript returned to the family. Several years later, it was stolen from the safe deposit box in the family's apartment in France. It next appeared with the border police between Belgium and Germany. Interpol got involved. The family claimed it, but they were told that the manuscript was destined for a German library and that they would have to prove their own ownership of it. Of course, they were able to do so from the photographs supplied with the help of Christie's, as well as the family ex libris still visible in the front paste down. Through private treaty, the manuscript is now part of Les Enluminures. You saw it briefly in session 1. It's the one with the parchment pages turning. As Stephen Nichols so rightly observed in the first talk today, every rose is polyphonic, offering, quote, an open generative work across an expansive landscape, end quote. Thus, every Rose manuscript enhances our understanding of how its contemporaries perceived it. Although we do not know the original owner of the Janson Rose, we do know where it was written and painted in modern day Tournai by the Flemish illuminator Jean Simon. The identification of the artist also helps to date the manuscript around 1390 to 1400. Our illuminator was active as late as 1413. He must have rubbed shoulders with Iconian painters, Robert Campin, and possibly even Roger van der Weyden. His frontispiece, which tells the whole story of the rose in a single picture, is unique among hundreds of Rose manuscripts. Fully clothed, the dreamer lover lies in bed. Before sleeping, he propped his sword on his pillow. His books, pen and parchment are laid out on the desk with an attached arm and a chair next to his bed. He must have been a nearsighted 20-year-old because we see his discarded spectacles alongside his quills. His dream takes visual form in the 2 chapelets exchanged by the lovers hanging above him. At the foot of the bed is the enclosed garden where fair welcome will admit him so he can steal a kiss from the unattainable rose on the bush within. The tower in which jealousy then indignantly imprisons fair welcome is shown in the right background, in the modest, tall, narrow house, not unlike the houses that adorn Roger van der Weyden's painting. The rose bush, secure from the lovelorn young man, stands on the balcony. The delightful marginal illustration is also unique. In the lower left, a monkey tosses food from a bowl, while a brewer in front of him offers a drink to accompany his food. On the lower right, a monk with a dragon body gestures in supplication to a nun who holds in her right hand what appears to be a rosary. A mermaid is a symbol of luxury. A squirrel holding and burrowing nuts appear in the upper and right margins. Of course, such grotesques are intended to entertain, whether they comment directly or indirectly on the text. Here, we might hypothesize that the bodily enjoyment of food and drink on the lower left is playfully contrasted to the spiritual benefits of prayer in the lower right, a theme that is, of course, consistent with most interpretations of the text of the rose, but given special prominence here in the frontispiece. The texts in the Janson Rose belong to Langlois Group 1, considered less common but les meilleurs. The Janson Rose is also one of only 19 copies to contain additions and moralizing revisions made by a third author, Guy de Maury, a Picard cleric, and it is written in Picard dialect. Guy de Maury added, deleted, and rearranged many passages with the general effect of bringing the love story at the heart of the poem, more in line with traditional Christian notions of human and divine love. Manuscripts of the Rose are often accompanied, as here, with other shorter works by the second poet, Jean de Meun, the Testament and the Codicil. These two poems, written at the end of the poet's life, are so linked to the Rose that they are sometimes considered to be satellite works or spin-offs of it. They rarely occur in manuscript copies of their own, and especially in 14th century examples, they accompany the Rose. The Testament is framed as an edifying conclusion to the Rose, in which the author apologizes for the folly of youthful works he wrote just to achieve success, and embarks on a spiritual journey to discover truth and good. The much shorter Codicil, with its appeal to God and its 88 lines, is considered an appendix to the Testament. The text of the Janson Rose is thus rare in its inclusion not only of Guy de Maury's revisions, but also Jean de Meun's spin-offs, offering a complete, quote unquote, Rose. Not only do these features corroborate Stephen Nichols' insistence on a collaborative model of creativity, they also underscore the asynchronous nature of textual transmission. The miniatures tie the three texts together, casting the love story in a decidedly Christian context. The Trinity shows God the Father supporting Christ, a dove above them. This is a direct illustration of the opening phrase of Jean de Meun's Testament, the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, in three persons, loved and adorned. The next miniature depicts Christ in majesty, seated on a bench, one hand raised in blessing. Here, illustrating the opening of a stanza, not this one in the Codicil, this powerful King of glory who lives and reigns forever. The recovery of the stolen Janson Rose, and hence our opportunity to study it in its integrity as a material object, allows us to understand it better within the dynamic transmission of Rose manuscripts. I think we can all agree that our study of medieval manuscripts places us in a little known and perhaps a little understood niche in society. As a result, thefts are not often widely reported or appropriately punished. As a lost and found example, it is perhaps worth returning to the Columbia University Rose, which Meradith mentioned, where we have a transcript of the court case during the plea phase. Spiegelman, the thief, admitted his guilt on all counts. And this court case includes a published sentencing of Daniel Spiegelman in April 24th, 1998. 1998 seems to be the crucial year here. Google, the Digital Rose, and Daniel Spiegelman. Whereas the thief Spiegelman acknowledges the economic loss calculated at $1.3 million, his arguments for leniency rest on his claim that there was, quote, no harm to scholarship from the theft because the items are, quote, of little importance and do not differ in any substantial way from photographic or other records of them. The defendant's plea goes so far as to claim that the infrequent requests by readers to view individual manuscripts should be admitted as evidence of the material's little importance. According to the legal system in the United States, punishment for grand theft is traditionally measured based on the market value of stolen goods. The decision of Judge Kaplan to depart from the sentencing guidelines and to double the sentence of the defendant is a landmark case for lost and stolen manuscripts of any kind, not just the Rose. I'm not going to read you Judge Kaplan, you can see it here. Stunting the knowledge, growth of human knowledge, etc. Thank you.
Okay, what a terrific also note to end the presentations on. And now we have a chance to have our conversation between Sandra and Meradith. So Meradith, we'll get Meradith back on the screen. There you go. And you can pose questions to one another for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a little time at the end for everyone to come on.
Sandy, I have a question. Your expertise as an educator and certainly also with Les Enluminures, I have a question about what is perhaps for you the most challenging in dealing with new collectors of medieval manuscripts?
Well, I suppose being an educator, it's about educating them to appreciate and understand manuscripts. A question I'm asked all the time is, like, which do you like better, like your old life or your new life, being a teacher or being a dealer? And I always get confused because it's like they're asking me whether I like my right arm better than my left arm. It all feels like sort of the same thing to me. So, teaching about manuscripts, for example, what we've done with the Janson Rose, doing a video, doing a little book on it, is, aimed at, making it understood and appreciated, whether it's by new collectors or by my coterie of colleagues and scholars and former students and interns and staff, etc.
And a further question of a practical nature, and that is, I've heard it said, have been told that with the increasing number of medieval manuscripts entering collections, libraries, university collections, permanent collections, is that presenting any difficulty for collectors finding new manuscripts or manuscripts that are still available, still on the market?
Every generation says, oh, there's no more material. And, of course, like a certain percentage of material goes into institutions. And so it is not, quote, available to a collector in the same way that something that is not in an institution, but institutions deaccession. And it's, there is material available. I wanted to, and since we sort of started with the Digital Rose and our ending sort of with you and your book, I wanted to ask you if you could talk about the relationship between the Digital Rose and your research over the past decades on the Rose, and also when can we expect your book?
Well, you heard what's involved in the book and why, and that might suggest why the beat goes on. One of the things that concerns me is that digitization is, of course, an invaluable tool. But as has been pointed out by other speakers, it is also a different tool. And what I'm hearing from younger scholars and some advanced graduate students is that institutions are increasingly saying to them, look, it's digitized. You don't need to see the original manuscript. And of course, we would argue au contraire, but it is, I'm hearing this more and more.
And when? You skipped over the when?
The when?
Perhaps projected date?
I'm not going to commit myself to a projected date, but it is nearing a publication date. Let me leave it that way.
And you mentioned that you began with your interest in the iconography of the rose, and I thought the discussion, all the discussions are interesting, but that between Elina and Jonathan was especially fascinating for the kind of, flexibility is not the right word, but the multiple ways in which we can now see the iconography. So I wondered if you might give us a little spoiler as to how much your book is intended to deal with the iconography of the miniatures, which is, would be such a vast number of miniatures involved.
Absolutely true, that there are a vast number of miniatures. As was mentioned, each time a researcher comes to study the miniatures or the iconography of the rose, they come with different backgrounds, with different expectations, with different eyes. And so the person who, I would say, that the person who comes to the physical object and looks at those miniatures in the flesh and on the flesh or paper has a different experience of the text, of the pictures, of the rose than does someone who comes only with a digital experience. It's not an either or, but I think it's good for us to keep in mind that there are differences. One little sidebar is that the comment was made about, I think it was Stephen, that when the student gets these huge 300 folio manuscripts put in front of them, that they can be overwhelmed. But there are also rose manuscripts that are teeny tiny. They're really like so. So again, the rose is so many, we can't talk about only a large manuscript, only a small manuscript. Each physical object is indeed unique. If you're looking at one of these little tiny manuscripts, you're going to have a different experience than if you look at one of the huge codices.
I wonder if the rose is not, this goes back to other discussions we've had earlier in this webinar. I wonder if the rose is not distinct as being the genre or text that is most different in manuscript after manuscript. I'm trying to think of biblical illustration, or even Nina, I don't know, even your World Chronicles. I'm trying to think of another genre where there is so much diversity, big, small, no illustration, lots of illustration, completely different illustrations. It certainly supports Stephen's idea about the creativity and the dynamic transmission and other comments about the individual interpretations.
This is actually a good moment for me to leap in. That's a nice cue to bring everyone back on the screen, please. And we can have a grid with everyone. If everyone could turn their cameras on, all of our participants. And Christina, if you could make sure everyone is visible. Maybe some of you would want to pick up on that question that Sandra just asked. Is there another text that is that was again repackaged and rethought as in such a range of ways, the way the Roman de la Rose or in your work, do you find it as being a kind of singular phenomenon in the sort of that history of sort of manuscript recensions? Let's see, how do we make, is everyone else looking at a grid? Gallery there, okay. Oh, wow, and Brian brought his child. Yes, hello. Okay, sorry.
If I can just jump in, it seems to me that the reason the rose has, and this is, I mean, let me say that I found this whole discussion fascinating, not only fascinating because of the range of topics, but I love the fact that we had a whole range of generations, and Jonathan and Elina being perhaps the most recent to become to burst on the screen as rising stars in Rose studies, and it's really fascinating to see. It's fascinating, and also from my point of view, given the fact that I became a medievalist partly because I thought that I was told by my professors that nobody else went into the Middle Ages. Everybody was going to the 20th century. This was a long time ago. And so I thought, well, I don't need to begin my career with a lot of competition. Let me start where there isn't. And then I was told by Eleanor Bulatkin that the Middle Ages are dying. And you know, the Rose in those years was only taken on by people in the English department. It had been a long time since any American in a French department or art history, let alone had tackled it. So it's really exciting to see how the Rose has become a kind of phoenix for medieval studies generally. I only wish we could get deans and provosts to make enough appointments so that we could have young people get jobs in this field. Anyway, to go back to the question, it seems to me that the Rose has the protean form that it does because it lasted so long. It was created, I'm convinced, in the 13th century as the first work that I know of. And I started with the with the Chanson de Roland, with romances. And when I hit the Roman de la Rose in a seminar at Yale with Daniel Poirion, what struck me first off was that Guillaume de Loris, I thought, surely had written this with the then budding notion of manuscript illumination in mind. It was the first text that seemed to me to be ekphrastic, and not just with the portraits on the wall that Jonathan talked about and Elina so nicely, but also with just the notion of Jonathan raised the issue of poetry and art. Just the sheer description of Guillaume Loris of the lover having been admitted to the garden by oiseuses, the description of the birds, the description of the birds singing, it seems to me that is the most extraordinary transmission into a visual, verbal vision of singing and lyric poetry. And of course, this is immediately after the troubadour have been extremely popular. It was just extraordinary. And it seems to me that the Middle Ages, people in the Middle Ages must have found it different too. So that may not be an answer to the question, but it seems to me to be one of the reasons why it just appeals to so many different imaginations in the Middle Ages.
Maybe the text, I don't know, Jonathan would be able to answer this better. Maybe the text is more since it's so complicated, Elina, you said your students hate it. Since it's so complicated, maybe it's the fact that the text is that complicated that the manuscript tradition and the illustrations and the size and everything are so different. This kind of goes back to a question that I wouldn't be able to answer that Christine raised, which is, why is it a bestseller? I mean, I think that's a difficult question. Anyway, Jonathan.
So in terms of it being difficult, I think a lot of it is super accessible if you're in the 13th or 14th century, and then huge parts of it aren't. The fact that it's about everything, there is something there for everyone. And one of the things that I think Sylvia Hewitt really brought out in amazing ways in her 1994 book, The Romance of the Rose and Its Medieval Readers, is how people didn't read the whole thing necessarily in a linear fashion, or it's not like a novel. Right. You would dip in and out of it. You would read it. Obviously you're going to use the images to read it in certain ways. But I had a moment at one point during my doctoral work where I just thought, if there's anything, there must be an answer in The Romance of the Rose, because it's so capacious. It's got things about optics, about the philosophy of money, about the nature of vision, the nature of belief. Questions of dreams. So in a sense, it's not an encyclopedia in any kind of meaningful sense, because it's completely disordered. But there's this, and because it's disordered, there is this fascination that you can always keep going back to and getting more. And I think, and I'm sure that went away as in the 15th and 16th centuries as the Old French got harder and harder to read. I mean, in like Morgan, is it Morgan 948, the rose that's made for Francois Ier. Was it made? Yeah, it was made for him. And there's a bit where there was one aspect of the rose that's been changed, so it refers to Francois himself, but it has to be indicated for him where on the manuscript, because he wasn't going to read it. And so the reasons for its popularity would have, I think, varied over time.
I'm interested in what you were saying about the romances and the troubadour lyrics. Am I on? I don't know. Yeah. The romances and the other fictional works that were composed during this period. And yet they have many fewer illustrations, and the ones which are illustrated have a much reduced complexity of illustrations. So instead of having the kind of variety you have in a Rose manuscript, in the individual illustrations, you have for example, the Tristan manuscript, you have two people talking, two people writing, they're generic in a way that the Rose illustrations certainly aren't.
So I just want one very quick, just before I see Christine's about to speak, but just the most obvious parallel, I think Tristan is such a different genre, but the Bestiaire d'amour, Richard de Fournival's Bestiaire d'amour, I think would probably be the closest thing in terms of the mouvance of images and the complexity of the subject matter. And I think that would be somewhere to go.
Can I just quickly echo what Jonathan said in terms of that the Romance of the Rose, no, it's not an encyclopedia or a mappamundi as it was often referred to. And yes, it does have a multitude of topics that it addresses, from political topics to religious topics to scientific, pseudoscientific topics. But I think one of the reasons why it was so popular is not only does it address a multitude of topics, but it also has these almost biblical exegesis type of levels of interpretation, right? From the literal to the metaphorical to the allegorical, at least those three levels. And I think that contributes to its wealth, where you not only have a range of seemingly disparate topics, but where you actually have linkages all throughout the rows on the metaphorical and especially, of course, the allegorical level. So, and I just would like to say, going back to what Jonathan said, as a graduate student, I remember how exhilarating it was to uncover some of those linkages. And I think that has contributed a lot to its popularity as well.
And I'm afraid I have to jump in here now because we're at the end of our time. I do want to note a comment from our colleague at Fordham, Susanne Hafner, who suggested, also connected to what Christine was just saying, the richness of the tradition, a parallel one finds in Ovid Moralizé manuscripts. And I also appreciate a comment that Melanie offered, because through her expertise in production, the thinking about this, a flurry of production with everyone working on their different choirs, copying their texts and illuminating them, also leads to the kinds of variety one finds. Am I characterizing it correctly, Melanie? Thank you. So again, what this underscores is just a wealth of knowledge and insight among all of our speakers today. This has just been a treat for me, and I appreciate our audience for sticking with us, and I apologize that we did not actually have time for your questions as these things go, but I am certain that our speakers would welcome, I don't know, emails or any kind of contact you want to make with them with other thoughts you want to share. But I just want to give a round of applause to our speakers today. You were wonderful, and to Christina Bruno for orchestrating all of this so beautifully. It was quite complicated. And thank you, Sandra. Totally fun to do.
Thank you, Nina and Christina and Fordham. This is the second venture we've done together, and I hope there are many more. But thank you, all the speakers too.
Thank you, and have a lovely afternoon or evening wherever you are. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.